Little House on the Prairie is a reminder of when things were simpler for us in our lives those 45 years ago.
When Florida first announced it was sending an army of dogs, tagged traitor snakes, and elite tribal hunters into the Everglades to fight a plague of giant pythons, the internet had a field day. People called it a joke. They called it a waste of taxpayer money. They said you can't out-hunt a snake that can hide in 2 feet of grass and vanish without a trace. Late-night hosts made fun of it. Comment sections filled up with jokes about the Sunshine State losing its mind. But years later, the numbers coming out of the Everglades are nothing to laugh about, and the story of how Florida actually pulled this off is stranger, smarter, and more surprising than anyone expected. Stick around, because by the end of this you'll understand why what looked like a punchline turned into one of the most fascinating wildlife battles in American history. To understand why Florida had to do something this drastic, you have to go back to where the whole mess started. The Everglades is one of the most unique ecosystems on the planet, a slow-moving river of grass stretching across the southern tip of Florida, home to alligators, panthers, wading birds, and thousands of species found nowhere else on Earth. For most of the 20th century, it was a delicate but functioning wilderness. Then, starting in the 1980s, something began slithering into it that didn't belong there at all. Burmese pythons are native to Southeast Asia, and back in the 80s and 90s they became wildly popular in the American exotic pet trade. People bought them as hatchlings, cute little snakes barely longer than a pencil. The problem is that Burmese pythons don't stay small. They can grow to 18, even 20 feet long, and weigh well over 100 pounds. A lot of owners had no idea what they were signing up for, and when the snake in their living room started looking more like something out of a nightmare, more than a few of them made the same decision. They drove out to the edge of the Everglades and let it go. Then, in 1992, disaster struck in the form of Hurricane Andrew, one of the most powerful storms to ever hit South Florida. The storm tore through a python breeding facility near the Everglades, and by most accounts, hundreds of pythons escaped into the wetlands in the chaos that followed. Between the pet releases and the storm, the Everglades suddenly had a breeding population of a massive, non-native predator with no natural enemies in its new home. And breed they did. A single female Burmese python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs at a time. With no predators keeping their numbers in check, aside from the occasional full-grown alligator, the population exploded. What started as a handful of escaped pets became tens of thousands of pythons spreading through South Florida's wetlands. The damage was almost immediate and absolutely brutal. Researchers doing wildlife surveys in python-heavy areas started noticing something disturbing. The animals that used to be everywhere were simply gone. Raccoons, opossums, rabbits, foxes, even bobcats, all had crashed in numbers wherever pythons had taken hold. In some of the hardest-hit survey areas, populations of small and medium mammals had dropped by well over 90%. Deer were vanishing. Wading birds were vanishing. There are documented cases of pythons swallowing entire white-tailed deer and even attempting to take down alligators. This wasn't just an invasive species being a nuisance. This was an apex predator quietly eating its way through the food web of one of America's most treasured ecosystems, and almost nobody outside of Florida even knew it was happening. To put a number on just how bad it got, one Everglades documentary crew following python hunters put the figure at roughly 90% of native mammal species wiped out in the hardest-hit stretches of the park over the last few decades. Frogs, deer, wild pigs, alligators, species that used to be a normal part of a night drive through the park practically disappeared from python territory. For an ecosystem that took millions of years to reach its balance, that kind of collapse in a matter of decades is almost unheard of. Here's the part that made the whole situation so maddening for wildlife officials. Pythons are almost impossible to find. These are not animals that go crashing through the underbrush or leave obvious tracks. A Burmese python's camouflage is so effective that researchers have described looking directly at a spot where a snake is sitting and seeing nothing but grass. They are ambush predators built by evolution to be invisible. And in a landscape as vast and tangled as the Everglades, that camouflage becomes almost unbeatable. For years, the state's main strategy was simple. Pay people to drive the levees and access roads at night with spotlights, looking for pythons crossing the pavement or basking on the warm asphalt. It worked, to a point. Independent hunters and later state-sponsored bounty hunters did remove pythons this way, sometimes in the low hundreds per year. But road cruising only catches snakes that happen to be near a road on a given night, and it does almost nothing to reach the pythons hiding deep in tree islands and sawgrass marshes miles from the nearest access point. Wildlife officials estimated that road searches were only catching a tiny fraction of the actual population, which researchers believe may number anywhere from 100,000 to as many as several 100,000 snakes spread across South Florida. Something had to change. The old approach wasn't going to cut it. And that's when Florida wildlife agencies started getting creative, bringing in help that had nothing to do with rifles or traps and everything to do with noses, instincts, and a bit of snake-on-snake betrayal. And this is exactly why, when Florida first rolled out its new strategy, so many people online treated it as a joke. Headlines about python-sniffing dogs and traitor snakes sounded like something out of a satirical news site rather than an actual government wildlife program. Commenters joked that the state had run out of real ideas. Some hunters who'd spent years doing things the traditional way were openly skeptical that a house pet or a single-tagged snake could accomplish what armed patrols couldn't. It genuinely looked, on paper, like Florida was grasping at straws. What almost nobody outside the program realized at the time was that wildlife biologists had already done the math, and the math said the old way simply could not scale to a population this large in terrain this difficult. They needed senses and instincts that no human patrol could replicate, and that's exactly what they went looking for. The first wave of creatures Florida deployed weren't hunters at all. They were dogs. Specifically, Labrador retrievers, the same breed used for years to sniff out bombs, drugs, and even bed bugs. Wildlife officials reasoned that if a dog's nose was sensitive enough to detect a few grams of explosive material hidden in luggage, it might just be sensitive enough to detect a python hiding in the brush. Training these dogs wasn't simple. Handlers used python-scented towels and snakes fitted with tracking implants to teach the dogs what they were searching for. But there was an extra wrinkle here that didn't apply to bomb-sniffing work. These dogs needed to find the target without getting anywhere near it. A 12-foot constrictor is not something you want your search dog walking straight up to. So trainers taught the dogs something called a fringe response, essentially teaching them to catch the scent from a distance, sit down, and stare intently in the snake's direction rather than closing in on it themselves. It's the canine equivalent of a bird dog pointing at a pheasant instead of pouncing on it. The results were staggering. During peak season, teams working with detector dogs found a python roughly every 2 hours while covering around 6 miles of terrain. Compare that to the old method of driving roads for hours and sometimes going 300 to 500 miles between sightings, and you start to understand why wildlife officials were so excited. Dogs that had once sniffed suitcases at airports were now some of the most effective python hunters in the entire program. Florida wasn't the only place looking for outside expertise, either. In one especially inventive move, officials brought in members of the Irula tribe from Tamil Nadu, India, a community whose traditional occupation for generations has been catching snakes by hand. The Irula trackers had spent their lives learning to read subtle signs in the dirt and vegetation that most people would never notice. A faint disturbance in leaf litter, a slight depression in the soil, a barely visible trail through the grass. In their very first week working in the Everglades, the Irula team pulled more than a dozen pythons out of environmentally sensitive areas, including habitat critical to endangered species like the Key Largo woodrat. It was proof that sometimes the most effective technology isn't technology at all. It's generations of human skill that modern hunters simply didn't have. It wasn't just Labradors, either. Over time, the detector dog program expanded to include other dogs previously trained for entirely different careers. A pair named Floyd and Vito, both originally trained to detect explosives, were repurposed for python work and sniffed out 5 snakes in the tangled hardwood hammocks of North Key Largo during a single 4-month deployment, an area so dense and overgrown that human searchers had struggled to cover it effectively at all. As one biologist involved in the program put it, a python can be sitting in plain sight and a person will walk right past it, but a dog doesn't need to see the snake. It only needs to smell it. That single difference, sight versus scent, turned out to be the whole ballgame. But the strategy that really turned heads, the one that sounds almost too strange to be true, involves turning the pythons against each other. Researchers realized that during the winter breeding season, Burmese pythons do something unusual for a normally solitary animal. They gather. Females release pheromones that call in multiple males from the surrounding area, sometimes forming what biologists have nicknamed a breeding aggregation, essentially a python meetup, with several males converging on a single female. Scientists realized that if they could track one of those males, he would lead them straight to the exact spot where the biggest, most reproductively important female in the area was hiding. So they started surgically implanting radio and GPS transmitters into captured male pythons, then releasing those males back into the wild. Researchers call this the Judas technique, named after the idea that the tagged snake will unknowingly betray his own kind by leading hunters straight to a breeding gathering. Biologist Dean Butler, who leads one of the most successful scout snake programs in southwest Florida, has described his tagged males less as traitors and more as sentries standing watch, radioing back the exact coordinates of the enemy's most valuable target. And it works. One tracked male named Argo led a research team to a breeding aggregation that included 7 pythons all in one spot, among them a female weighing well over 100 pounds. Another operation using tagged males named Christopher and George helped researchers pull hundreds of pounds of python out of a single stretch of marsh in one day. Since the program began, Bartosek's team alone has removed more than 1,300 pythons from roughly 150 square miles of territory near Naples, adding up to an estimated 35,000 pounds of snake, more than 17 tons, taken out of the ecosystem through this method. The real value isn't even in the adult snakes removed, though. It's in the eggs those snakes never got to lay. A single female python in southwest Florida carries an average clutch size in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 eggs, and researchers have documented individual females carrying anywhere from a dozen to well over 100 developing eggs at once. By intercepting breeding-age females before they nest, wildlife teams estimate they've prevented tens of thousands of future pythons from ever hatching. Every scout snake released back into the wild isn't just a tracking device with scales, it's a weapon aimed directly at the next generation of the invasion. It doesn't come cheap, though, and that's part of why the program raised eyebrows early on. Radio tracking a single python through the Judas technique can cost somewhere in the range of $11,000 per snake actually captured, compared to a few $1,000s per snake caught through basic road patrols. Critics pointed to that price tag as proof the whole approach was impractical. But wildlife biologists countered that the technique isn't really about cost per snake, it's about reaching the snakes nothing else can reach. The big, reproductively mature females hiding deep in terrain that road crews and even dogs can't easily access during breeding season. Removing one of those large, egg-laden females can prevent more future pythons than removing dozens of smaller, non-breeding snakes ever could. When researchers actually did the math on eggs prevented rather than dollars spent, the strange, expensive-looking program suddenly looked like one of the smartest investments in the entire fight. If dogs and traitor snakes weren't unusual enough, Florida's fight against pythons has only gotten stranger from there. Researchers have experimented with robotic rabbits designed to mimic the movement and warmth of a live animal, hoping to lure hungry pythons into camera range. They've tested environmental DNA sampling, a method where scientists filter water samples from canals and marshes to detect trace genetic material that pythons leave behind, essentially tracking snakes through invisible clues in the water itself, without ever having to see one. In one of the more unexpected experiments, biologists even started fitting GPS collars onto opossums, betting that if they tracked enough prey animals long enough, some of those opossums would eventually get eaten by a python, and the resulting data would reveal exactly where the predator had been. Not every idea worked out. Scientists tried using live rabbits as bait animals in traps to lure pythons in for capture, and while it showed some promise in certain trials, later research found that simple mammal scent lures on their own didn't meaningfully increase detection rates, a reminder that for every breakthrough in this fight, there have also been dead ends. On top of the science, Florida built an entire economic incentive structure around python removal. The state's Python Elimination Program and Python Action Team together pay contracted hunters for their time and offer bonus pay based on the length of python removed, with larger snakes worth more since they represent more breeding potential taken off the board. Florida also holds an annual public event called the Python Challenge, where everyday hunters, including total beginners, can register, get trained, and compete to remove as many pythons as possible in a set period, with cash prizes for the most and the longest snakes caught. What started as a niche government program became something the public could actually take part in, turning python removal into both a conservation effort and, strangely enough, a sport. The Python Challenge in particular deserves a closer look because it's a big part of why the public perception of this program shifted from mockery to genuine interest. Anyone can sign up, including people who have never handled a snake in their life. Participants go through required online training covering how to identify a Burmese python versus a native species, how to safely and humanely dispatch one, and where they are legally allowed to search. Then they head into designated public lands for a set competition window, sometimes camping out overnight, driving levees with spotlights, and wading into marsh grass in the middle of the night chasing a payday and bragging rights. Prize categories reward the most pythons caught and the single longest snake, turning what used to be a quiet, specialized government operation into something that thousands of ordinary people now travel from across the country to take part in every year. There's even a commercial angle now. A partnership between the state and a company called Inversa has started turning removed python skins into leather goods, everything from wallets to boots to footballs, giving the culled snakes an afterlife as sustainable fashion material and adding another funding stream to keep the removal programs running. All of this experimentation reflects something important about how wildlife management has changed. A decade ago, the default response to an invasive species crisis was to throw more manpower and more bullets at it. Florida's python fight became a proving ground for a completely different philosophy: use the invader's own biology against it. Track its mating instincts. Exploit its need to reproduce. Follow its prey. Sample the water it swims through for traces of its own DNA. It's a slower, stranger, more scientific style of warfare, but as the results have shown, it's also a far more sustainable one, because it doesn't rely on getting lucky and stumbling across a snake in the open. It relies on understanding exactly how the animal thinks and behaves, then turning that knowledge into a trap it can't see coming. So did any of this actually work? This is where the people who laughed at Florida's approach have had to eat their words. Since organized removal efforts ramped up, more than 23,000 wild Burmese pythons have been documented and removed from Florida and officially reported to state wildlife authorities. The Python Elimination Program alone has passed well over 1,800 captured snakes, some of them true giants.